Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Toby Campen, and if you're not familiar with him, Toby is a mastering engineer based out of Brighton in the UK, and throughout his career, he's done a lot of different work, everything ranging from audio post-production, where he worked with facilities such as Pinewood Studios, Technicolor, and Grand Central Recording Studios, and currently he's transitioning from the audio post-production world into audio mastering for artists. So I wanted to have him on here because his story is actually very similar to mine in many ways. I got started as a musician, eventually worked my way into recording studios, working with bands. Then I got into audio post-production where I worked in there for a number of years. And then finally, it led me to eventually coming back to the studio. And now, instead of doing full production work and mixing work, I'm mainly just niching down to mixing and mastering. So I see some similarities between my story and Toby's. So it was really great to hear where some of those parallels are and where they differ. And in today's episode, we get into a lot about working in audio post-production and what it's like to work in that world, but also how you can transfer those skills to other areas of the audio industry, specifically mastering in Toby's case. So we definitely talk about that. And we also dive deeper into Toby's process when it comes to mastering. And we cover a whole bunch of different things there. Everything from knowing when to work in the box versus out of the box, knowing how far to go with processing your tracks. And we also dive into mastering on headphones, because that's something that Toby has started to do himself after chatting with one of our former guests on this podcast, Elaine Rasnick. So we get into all of that stuff. And if you're someone who is interested in getting into mastering, but maybe you don't have the ability to have big fancy speakers in your house, I think you're going to really enjoy this because we get into some of the tools that Toby likes to use to help him with mastering on headphones in order to make sure that he's accurately monitoring and that the masters that he's making can actually translate outside of his studio. So that is definitely a really important part of the mastering process. So again, if you're someone who isn't sure about whether you can master professionally on headphones, I think you're going to find a lot of value out of this episode. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Toby Campen, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going, man?
Hey, thanks for having me on. Yeah, great to meet you. Thank you.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you and your background and who you are, what you do, and how you got into all this stuff, can you give us that story?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been a mixing engineer since about 2006. That was when I really started out recording my own bands and friends' bands and things like that. After that, I ended up working in TV and film, kind of to pay the bills, which I was been doing for about 10 years. Been really lucky. I got to work over at Pinewood Studios in the UK, which is a really famous place for making films. And then, I kind of got back into the music stuff during COVID and started mastering around that time. And I've been sort of building that up ever since. I'm in the process of making that my full-time job now.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's kind of me.
So I think that you're in a similar boat to a lot of people where it's like you get started because you're like, maybe you got that background on music and that's what you want to get into. But then you mentioned that you got into like audio post, which I think is like audio post is like, it's a pretty specialized field. And I used to work in audio post as well, so I can kind of relate to that same sort of journey as you, especially now, like, same thing. Like I went back to, like, I started in the studio, went to audio post, started doing more mixing, and then now I'm like leaning more towards the mastering side of things too. So I think there's a lot of parallels in our story. But what was that experience like for you getting into the audio post world? Because it is very different than working on traditional music.
Yeah, it's very, I'd say, regimented. It's a bit more stable, I would say. There's a lot more structure to it, but I think it takes longer to progress. I think, like music, it's very much, how music used to be. It's quite structured, and there's a lot more formal training and things like that. Whereas, as you probably find yourself in the music world, you find a lot of people are self-taught. So I do consider myself very lucky that I got to work at Pinewood and Technicolor and I had some really nice formal training. I mean, I guess we can talk about that more later, but I'm very grateful that I had that really solid foundation. And I think it made me work really fast. I would say that's definitely been something that I've found kind of coming back to music, that I'm a lot more decisive now, because with audio post, you've got clients in most days and they're sitting on the sofa, there's a lot of pressure. A lot of music stuff, as we probably know, especially post-COVID, is not always attended. So you've got that moment to sort of take a breath and think about the decisions you're making. Whereas I found with audio posts, you know, the minute COVID stopped, everyone was back in the office, and clients are back in, and you just have to be pretty fast, I think.
Totally. Yeah, I found the same experience too. Like it's the audio post world it's very businesslike. It's very formal, you know, and it's very different than working with bands where it's like a little bit more casual and, you know, everyone's just like really chill. Whereas like audio post, there's like a lot of money going into it. There's a lot of big corporations behind the work. And so because of that, there's a lot more of that, that businessy feeling and, which actually I thought was a pretty good thing. I don't know if you feel that way too. Like I feel like it forces me to like, you know, treat things like more professionally and be more organized.
Yeah, like a lot of the shows I work on get sold to other countries and stuff. Like reversioning is a huge thing. And, you know, you can have a show that you worked on 6 months ago, come back and they say, you know, the stems aren't quite right for this part of the show. Things like that. And like you said, a lot of money folds on that. You know, they'll make more money sometimes selling the shows abroad than they will broadcasting them in the country that were made. So, yeah, like you said, when the money's involved, that's when you have to really know what you're doing. The same goes with major label albums and things like that.
Yeah. So what kind of jobs were you doing in the post world?
I did start off, like I was just saying, in film reversioning. Then I kind of sidestepped more into television broadcast shows. A lot of the stuff I work on now is documentaries for things like Discovery Channel. I've gone down to part-time in that, and I'm sort of, you know, ramping up my mastering work. So I'd like to say in like a year or two I'll be full-time mastering, but we'll see how that goes. But yeah, a lot of the stuff I work on is like documentary, lots of true crime, some sort of daytime factual stuff. Those sorts of shows. I did want to, I think back in the day, I did want to be a sound designer for Hollywood movies, but that didn't happen for me. So I ended up, you know, I wanted to be a proper mixer instead of an assistant. So I ended up working on more documentary stuff.
Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah, the documentary world is definitely the easiest way to get into the mixing side of things in post, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of them, especially with the boom in like true crime and stuff. It's there's a lot of that being made now. Yeah,
I would almost think that like with so much content being made even on YouTube, like there's probably people even coming to a lot of post studios for that kind of stuff too, like the professional people maybe.
Yeah, and podcasts, I've seen a big boom in that as well. You know, whereas a lot of people used to do them from their bedroom, you now see podcasts being made in studios. You know, with, you know, multi-angle cameras and stuff like that. Yeah, they're really sort of stepping up the quality in that, I think, as well.
Right on. Yeah. So let's rewind a little bit. Like, how did you ultimately, like, where did you learn the audio engineering side, or when it came to like, you know, getting into post production and stuff like that? Like, what made you feel like you were prepared for that, or how did you learn that stuff?
I did study at a college. I'm trying to think the comparison, because in the UK, university and college is slightly different. But yeah, I started studying when I was about 16. I did have a formal education, so I did a music tech degree. And while I was doing that, I was playing in bands. And one of my friends had a studio in his garage, which is where we started recording bands locally. And same as a lot of people, we just had all the local bands come in, do it that way. I was kind of self-taught, because I think, you know, as much as I would say formal education is good for people, most of mine was very like book orientated. We didn't do a lot. You know, we had an incredible SSL studio at my university, but you weren't allowed to touch it unless there was a tutor there. And, you know, they were very careful of letting the students anywhere near it. So yeah, I kind of got in the garage and was recording a lot of my bands and friends' bands on Logic back in the day. So I kind of learned a lot of those decisions, myself. And and then basically one of my friends got a job as a runner at a TV company. Then she managed to get me a gig as an assistant, and I worked night shifts for a couple of years doing track laying, which is, you know, dialogue editing, sound effects editing, that sort of stuff. So I was kind of straddling the two, music and TV at the same time. I've got it in the bio on my website, but yeah, I was in sort of in the kind of emo days. I was in a band that got to play at Download Festival, which was pretty cool.
Nice.
And off the back of that kind of propelled my music career as well at the same time while I was doing TV stuff. So I got to work with, some bigger bands, and we got to record in some amazing studios as well, where I got to sort of peek over the shoulder of the producers that were working with us and learn a lot of stuff. That, again, I think a lot of people probably learn that way as well. Like, when you're in a band and you go into the studio, all of a sudden you see all this incredible equipment and think, hey, this is what I'd like to do for a job. But yeah, and I got to steal some cool techniques off people when I was in bigger studios. So yeah, I've always kind of lived in those two worlds. But yeah, that's kind of cool. my background up to now.
Yeah. So then when you got into the post stuff, like what, but I think you maybe have said this already, but like, was it just because it was like a financial thing that like the post world, there's more money to get into, or was that maybe a career path you wanted to explore?
It is something I always was interested in. Like a part of my degree was sound design. And I've always loved films. I've always been quite a big film nerd. But yeah, I think it was at the time, I'd just moved to London because I grew up outside of London. But if you want to be in audio in the UK, London's kind of where it's at. There's some smaller. I mean, I live down in Brighton now, and there's a small media hub there for music and TV and film and everything. But yeah, I think it was probably a financial thing at the time. Like that happened for me when making a full-time living out of music wasn't happening for me. And then I've always kind of just straddled the two, and yeah, a lot of it is just making sure you've got enough money to survive, but also working on projects that inspire you, I think.
For sure. Yeah. So then, what made you ultimately decide to switch over to mastering and pursue that more? Like, was there like kind of a turning point for that, or?
Yeah, it was. I think I don't know. I kind of got to a point in my early 30s where I was like, I need to actually follow something I'm really passionate about. I think I'd come off the back of doing a string of adverts that I wasn't that fussed about working on, because I do some commercial stuff as well as a freelancer. And yeah, I think I just had a bit of an epiphany of life is too short to just pay the bills. I need to really pursue what I wanted to do. And out of all of the jobs in music, mastering was the one that always fascinated me the most. It was the one that that I kind of saw my skill set benefiting the most, I guess, because I mean, yourself, if you've worked in post as well, RX is a big part of that, and I've spent years kind of honing my RX skills in post and in mastering as well. Being able to spot things on a spectrogram and stuff's quite a niche skill. So yeah, I think all of my skill sets kind of lent towards that, and I've always preferred the kind of looking at the bigger picture part of the music process that is mastering. And I think as well, like I'm friends with quite a few amazing music mixers, and I kind of looked at what I could do when I'm mixing, because I do still mix my own band stuff from time to time, and I work with some of my friends' bands, but I was like, I'm okay at mixing, but I'm not as good as some of these other people, but I am quite good at mastering. When I've mastered tracks, people have been like, wow, I don't know how you did that. So it was, I don't know, it was the part of the process that I guess I felt I excelled at the most.
Yeah. Do you think that people need to have that experience in mixing in order to get into mastering?
I don't know if you have to. I mean, like just before we started, we were talking about the other mastering engineers that we know in the UK, like Katie Tavini, for example, says she's been a mixer, but she's not for long. And I don't think there are some amazing mastering engineers that have never been mixers. It definitely helps, I guess. I think it helps being able to put yourself in the shoes of a mixer and a musician, I guess, as well. I think, yeah, like having played an instrument definitely helps, I think, because you can understand the process and what makes up, the music that you're working on, and what fits into certain frequency spectrums and things like that. I think it helps for sure. But yeah.
What about, so obviously like, there's that concept of learning mixing before you get into mastering, but let's also consider your audio post-production work and how that impacts your mastering work. Like you talked about using RX and stuff like that. Do you feel like there's any other interchangeable skills there?
Yeah. I mean, I started out when I was an assistant doing restoration. I didn't mention this back when we were talking about where I started my career, but I did start out restoring old film and DAT tapes and things like that. I worked at a big archiving lab that Technicolor used to run over at Pinewood. So we were getting things off of old beat up cassettes that, sometimes didn't work. And I know restoration's like a huge part of that, but a lot of that was you'd get in, you could get off of these tapes as a stereo file. And then we had to denoise it, process it, up to modern standards that could be put on streaming or something like that. So we're getting all these old films and music videos and things like that. Yeah, and that is essentially, at the core of it, that is mastering. I mean, some of this stuff had to be mastered. Some of it wasn't the right, dynamic range tool. So yeah, I guess I technically started mastering before I was really mixing, before I was allowed behind the console. Yeah, and that definitely helped a lot. And I think, back in the day, in bigger studios, people, from what I've heard, often did start out in the mastering lab before you were allowed to mix. So, I think there's definitely like a place for that, doing it the other way around to the way a lot of people are doing things nowadays.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I can totally understand and relate to that as well. Like I found that from my audio post-production experience, like I definitely learned a lot about audio cleanup, and like that made me listen to music a lot more critically, because I was listening for like little noises and clicks and pops and stuff like that most people just ignore, or like, don't even think to consider.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. I mean, I'm sure you get this a lot. You're surprised how many sort of clicks and edits and things slip through a mix when you're doing a master. You can save most of it in RX, but yeah, there's a lot. I think as well, mixers have their eye on the big picture, whereas when it comes to mastering, you're listening to something for the first time and a click will jump out at you. But yeah, it took me years to hear that. When I was starting out as an assistant, my boss would come in and, just stand over my shoulder for a few minutes and say, there's a click there, you need to go back and fix it. And I was like, well, I can't even hear what you're talking about. So I think it takes quite a long time to develop your ear to become a mastering engineer, I guess.
Totally. I hate how sensitive my ears are to clicks and pops now.
Yep. Yeah.
I catch them all over the place.
Yeah, you sometimes have a track where you're like, you're playing through and you're just like, oh God, I've picked up like 10 clicks in this 30-second section. Do I treat all of these and spend hours on this or not? But yeah, I guess, like you said, some people are just, once you can hear that stuff, you can't unhear it, and it can make life really tricky.
Hey, but I guess that's kind of the goal with all of this. As you get more experience and you fine tune your ears to hear those details, that's what makes people get good at this, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yep. Right on. Well, I'd love to transition into your mastering and talk a little bit more about that and learn a little bit more about your process. So, like when you start mastering a track, like what's your typical mindset going into a new project? Like where do you start? How do you start?
So I mean, I'll listen through. I usually take notes if, just my first initial impressions of a track. And then I would probably, I don't know if this is a bit backwards to what some people do. I'll usually put on compressor or limiter first, just to kind of get it up to loudness. And then to me, at that point, my ear would, hear what's wrong with the track. I say what's wrong, what I'd like to correct, EQ wise, tonally, things like that. And that's kind of my process. If the clients give me any refs, then I'll probably have a listen to the references as well. If they want to sound like any other records or past work, things like that. That's kind of my process from like the initial parts of mastering. And if it's an album, I'll obviously sit down, listen through to the whole thing from start to finish, get an idea of what the sort of palette is that we're working with.
Gotcha. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And obviously, having your it sounds like you're kind of using your limiter to get more of that volume out, as opposed to just using like a gain tool and having a limiter set.
Yeah. It's kind of just getting it up to the sort of loudness that you're looking for, and then I kind of find at that moment what needs to be done kind of jumps out at you. And if there's any extra cleanup to do, at that point it will kind of become quite clear, because I know a lot of mixers that don't work with a limiter on all the time. They'll just pop it on at the end to pass their mixes over to clients. And, if they're not listening to it as loud as we would be in the mastering process, sometimes they won't hear little things like clicks and pops. And at that point as well, it would probably become quite clear to me whether you'd be wanting to work in the box or out the box, if it's, saturated enough already or not. I've only kind of in the last year or two actually started working out the box. I was always an in the box person up until then. I don't know. I've always worked in the box because of, my audio post. You're always jumping from studio to studio. Everything in audio post is very strictly in the box these days, apart from, huge facilities that have like Neve consoles still. So yeah, I've only recently started working out the box, and it was a bit of an epiphany to me. It was like, oh, this is why so many top end mastering engineers are working out the box, because there is some magic that you can get by going out the box. That being said, I do respect a lot of the guys like Glenn Schick and stuff who are doing that sort of audio nomad thing. It can be done these days, and I guess they're sort of showing that you can travel anywhere with a pair of headphones and a laptop, and you can do the job. Yeah.
Well, you said that like when you're listening, it kind of gives you an idea of whether you should be in the box or out of the box. Mm-hmm. How do you determine that? Like, what is it that is that factor that you're like, this requires, some outboard gear as opposed to just, I can get away with keeping this in the box?
Yeah, I guess it's the sort of tone, the color of what you're working with. And there's a lot of factors. I guess it depends if the client's mentioned. So I have a client intake form on my website where clients will sort of say what they're looking for, whether that's, if they want it to sound a bit more analog, quote unquote, or whether they want it, a cleaner master, whether they just want me to kind of make sure it's, EQ'd nicely and ready to go out. So yeah, at that point I would listen. I have some mixers that I work with that have a lot of nice outboard gear, and they'll do all the saturation they want, and they literally just want me to tweak it a bit with EQ, and then it's ready to go out. Or I have a lot of people that I work with as well that are, home producers who want me to throw a lot of color at something. So yeah, I kind of, at that point, I would make the decision then whether I stay in or out.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you bring up the idea of color, because mastering is one of these, like, it's a field where there's a lot of people who believe that mastering should just be about keeping everything clean and really honoring what's in the mix. And then there's other people who are like, I'm going to add my artistic stamp to it. So, knowing how far to go in either direction can be a challenge. So it sounds like that's kind of something that you would take care of through your intake form.
Yeah. It's again, that's something I've only put into place in the last sort of year or so. But I mean, I like you said, there are some mastering engineers who that have that as their thing. I will add my vibe to your master. I guess, I would say I'm like to think I'm capable of doing either. I can keep it pretty clean and just use very utilitarian in the box plugins, or I can add color to it if I only recently got an SSL Fusion, which I'm a bit behind the curve on that one, but there's like the transformer, for example, is great to add that vibe that people talk about. And there are some in the box plugins, like the massive passive and stuff that can also add. I still swear by the black box that can really add a lot of vibe to stuff as well. Yeah,
the thing with the, like, outboard gear in the mastering world is that it's so expensive to get into.
Oh yeah,
so you really have to know whether like it's going to be an important part of your process or not. Like you have to commit to that decision.
Yeah, I've bought and sold quite a few things recently, which is I've bought some stuff which I thought was going to change my life, and it didn't. And then again, like the Fusion was not cheaper, but it's for outboard gear. It was a cheaper bit of equipment that I'm enjoying quite a lot. And like I got a back CQ for a while that I thought was going to be everything I wanted, but it wasn't. You can spend a lot of money on stuff, and I just say if you're lucky enough to live in a country where you can go and demo things, go and demo them, because you can waste thousands of dollars buying and selling stuff that you aren't sure you want.
Yeah. So what does a typical mastering chain consist of for you these days then?
Yeah. So I usually start off with, I start off in the box. Usually, I'll start with a surgical EQ, usually something like Nova or the Ozone EQ I still use quite a lot. And that EQ will probably just be to, do any tight cuts I would sort of perceive as clearing up the mix. And then after that, if I'm going to use any saturation at that point, I probably would, if I'm in the box, then like I said, I'll use black box or something like that. Or at that point, I would probably go out the box. If I'm going to do any sort of saturation or EQ, then I'd do that sort of the tonal EQ. I would do that out of the box. And then after that, if I'm going to do compression, I'll probably do it then. I'm finding more and more actually these days that I don't use compression, because a lot of mixers that I work with compress the hell out of stuff, especially if it's like a rock track or something. A lot of the stuff I do is more of the sort of indie rock or sort of synthy kind of variations of genres these days. Like I work with a lot of sort of synthwave artists as well as rock and indie stuff. So it's usually in those camps, and a lot of that is actually already quite saturated depending on which mixers I'm working with. But yeah, and then after that, I would do any sort of imaging stuff if I'm going to do any stereo imaging. And then after that would be limiting. I do tend to use at least a couple of limiters, usually doing different jobs. I do like Fab Filter for my sort of heavy lifting limiter, because that can seem to take quite a lot of dynamic range out of things without being too audible if you get it right. And then after that, I tend to use the TDR limiter, which is quite transparent. I like that because that's a true peak limiter as well. A lot of people have opinions about those, but I tend to pop that at the end of my chain just to make sure nothing slips through at all. And then sometimes I'll lean on the Oxford limiter as well. I don't really use that for a lot of limiting, more for the enhanced fader that it's got. But yeah, I won't use all of those at once. So maybe use two, sometimes one if I only need one.
Yeah, but it makes sense that the way you described it, it kind of sounds like each one of those things is just adding its own little stamp. It's not like going real aggressively with any part of the chain. Yeah,
that's something that, again, actually, I picked that up from back in the audio post world, that using two compressors or sometimes three or two or three limiters back to back, doing a little bit instead of having one doing all the heavy lifting will get you more of a transparent result.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm the same way. And I guess I've always kind of been like that with even just mixing too. Like I've always found that when it comes to vocals, for example, like I love using serial compression and, feeding in 1176 and doing that LA2A or something like that. Yeah, I was going to say that trick is really that's
nice.
Like the classic move, right? But it definitely gives you that smoother sound and you're not like killing it with one or the other. It gives you like that more natural
definitely
compressed pro vocal sound, in my opinion. But and in the mastering world, it makes a lot of sense to do that too.
Yeah,
I think that's why like tools like the Shadow Hills compressor work, where it's like you've got two compressors in there at once, and the same sort of idea, right?
Yeah, that's what I don't actually use that myself, but I know a lot of people that swear by that. But yeah, that is, again, that's why it's built the way it is. I find compressor wise, I've really gotten into the SPL Iron lately. I don't know if you've used that much, but that seems to do something really nice, sort of the low end that I can't quite put my finger on what it does, but yeah, that's a really nice one.
I think my compressor choice these days is the Manley Varimu. I hated it for whatever reason early on. I just couldn't get it, and now it just like it clicked. It's so good, that thing.
Yeah, I've got the plug-in version of that, the Pulsar one, and again, that is. It's very colourful, but in the right situation, it's exactly what you need sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we talked about them a little bit earlier, but you said you're friends with former guest of the podcast, Elaine Rasnick. Yes. She was on episode 138. And on that episode, we talked a lot about mastering on headphones. Yeah. And I know when we were emailing about this episode, you had mentioned that she had convinced you to start getting into mastering on headphones. So I'd love to dive into that a little bit more and kind of learn a little bit more about what that process was like for you to get into mastering on headphones, and if it's something that you do more regularly these days. Or
I definitely do these days. I've moved around a lot because of jobs and moving to different cities and stuff. So my life I've always lived in the UK, but I moved from like Essex to London down to Brighton where I am now. And it takes a long time to adjust to a new room. And during COVID, I was, in an apartment living with my partner, so I couldn't be working on headphones every single day. On speakers every single day. So I started working on headphones more out of necessity, and started searching for, things to make them a bit flatter, like Sonar Works. And went through a lot of different headphones. I kind of landed on the Bayer Dynamics, which I think Elaine actually said on the podcast she uses. So I'm using the 990s. Got my eye on a pair of the Order Z headphones because I have seen a lot of people using those, and they look really nice. But I've worked on the 990s now for so long. I just know exactly what everything's going to sound like on those. So I actually stole from Elaine the plugin that she said she uses, Can Opener. Because that solved the sort of crossfeed issue that you get with headphones where, they're right in front of your ears and you don't get the spill from left to right and right to left that you do with speakers. So I kind of found over time that the combination of SonarWorks and Can Opener was just exactly what you need to get the headphones to translate. And I've gotten to a point where I've got a pair of PMCs, which are lovely speakers, they're mastering grade speakers, but I do most of my work on the headphones. I'll do like a sense check on the PMCs just to make sure that, the low end is vibrating your body in the right way and stuff like that. But and with, hearing the low end properly, I mean, the Bayer dynamics aren't perfect. I don't think they go down as low as some headphones do, but I know what things sound like on them. And again, a trick from Audio Post that I stole is, using metering, and I think we might have spoken about it over the emails, but yeah, sort of using things like tonal balance control to just sense check that you're hearing, what is on the meters as well and things like that. I use a lot of different tricks, but I've kind of got to a place where I just know that what I'm hearing in these headphones translates well, because I've spent, years and years looking for different speakers to test things on, like I've got a little Bluetooth speaker. I've got a little radio that I can plug an aux into, but I don't really find myself using any of that anymore, because I know that what I'm hearing in the headphones is going to translate well now.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a major importance to learning your speakers and getting to know them so well that what to expect off of them and what a mastered mix should sound like on them. So that makes sense. But as far as like that learning process, it's obviously very tricky whenever you're getting started. And I find with headphones are like an interesting thing where there's a lot of crappy headphones. There's a lot that have like these very colored sounds, or they're missing low end and that kind of stuff. So for someone who might be considering getting into mastering on headphones, like what's some advice you would give to those people as far as like learning how to learn your speakers or learn your headphones?
It's tricky. The hard answer is that you just have to put in the hours, I think. If you've got albums that you know what they sound like, then just listen, have a bunch of reference songs. I mean, I have about 5 or 6 songs that I just know what they sound like on every system. And, just if it should be a song that I'd say that maybe, has been your favorite song since you were like a teenager or something. So you know exactly instantly what you're hearing when you go to a system. I mean, I don't know. I was a metalhead growing up, so The End of Heartache by Killswitch is like my reference track, and I know exactly what that sounds like on every system. The minute that opening chord rings out, I'm like, there's something a bit off in the mid-range, or, the bottom end's out of whack on this system. Just having those reference tracks and working for, hours and hours. I mean, like I said, I spent the whole of COVID just on a pair of Bayer 990s, and I just know what these sound like now. And like you said, there are a lot of crappy headphones. I mean, I worked for a long time on the Sony MDR 7506s. They're like the NS10s of headphones. So they've got this huge like mid-range, but they don't have much low end. I think the Bayers were the first headphones I put on, and I was like, this is representing like most of the frequency range that I need. They've got like a huge bump in the low end and the highs, I think, but SonarWorks fixes that, and then you know that you've got a pretty flat response.
So you are still relying on SonarWorks to help kind of flatten out the curve a little bit more.
Oh yeah, I think Elaine said on her podcast that she doesn't use it, but I guess that's the one difference in our workflow, that I can't work without SonarWorks on the headphones for sure, because I just find that it makes everything translate a lot better.
Yeah, I guess the thing with SonarWorks that I've always found is like it can certainly work great. And with my headphones, like I've got like these like AKG K271s or whatever, and they're crap. Like they're just so scooped, and I find them really hard to work on. But once I got SonarWorks, that changed, and like it felt like it really balanced things out a lot more. And I started to trust it a lot more. So I think it really it does depend on what you're working with and how flat things are to begin with. If you do have those gaps, that's where SonarWorks can fix it. Yeah.
They do a deal as well where you can get I can't remember what they call it, but they will run a calibration on your pair as well, because obviously every pair of headphones is slightly different. So if you can get your hands on a pair that have been calibrated by them and then they send them to you, that's the perfect way to do it, because that the curve is exactly tailored to your headphones.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think for anyone who's on a budget, that is the best way to go about doing it. Because like the Odysseys, they're great headphones, but they're super expensive.
Yep, that's why I don't have a pair yet. But I will be getting. That's my next big purchase. But yeah, like personally for me, the Bayers are insanely cheap for what you get. I've been searching for ages for the right pair of headphones. So yeah, and I think Elaine said exactly the same thing. You know, they are ridiculously cheap for. I think she said when she moved over to the Odysseys, like it was an improvement, but it wasn't that radical day and night that she would expect for the extra $800 or whatever you're paying for a pair of Odysseys. Which is not, no beef on them. I'm sure they're incredible headphones.
Yeah, I mean, it seems kind of like a shame to have to use SonarWorks a little bit more on a pair of Odysseys, right? But
it's I guess it's like it's like getting a sports car. You're paying that extra 95% for like a tiny bit of improvement, but it's I'm sure there's a reason why people swear by them. Absolutely.
And then so you'd also talked about so SonarWorks helps you get that balanced sound, but then you talked about Can Opener, and Can Opener is just designed to just kind of simulate more of a room. Then
it simulates the crossfeed, so it's a very basic plugin. I just put that at the very end of my chain, and it just feeds a bit of the left to right and the right to left. I think if you have, I've got an RME converter that I use. Which also can simulate the crossfeed. And I think if you've got an RME interface, it can do that for you. But yeah, it's not like Slate VSX or anything like that. There's no room correction. Room emulation going on. It is simply just crossfeeding left to right. It's got a few different profiles in it, and it can do some more complex stuff than that, but I just use it for the crossfeed. And I found that sort of fixes any of the sort of low end perception that you get without it, because that is the problem with working on headphones is the low end is, I feel like it's a bit more exaggerated because obviously it's like right in front of your ears. Whereas once you switch on Can Opener, it just feels a little bit more like you're in a room.
That's great advice because that is like one of the challenges of headphones as well. Is like you have a very distinct right and left side. So to have that crossover definitely makes it feel like you're listening on speakers.
Yeah, I've actually never used any of the room simulators. Like I think Waves make one and Slate have their one. I've never used any of them, but I don't know. I got to a place where I know what translates well from what I'm doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of my hesitations with like VSX and all those things too, is that no matter what, you have to get used to listening with whatever processing you have on your headphones, whether it's SonarWorks or it's VSX or whatever. It takes time to learn that stuff. But then when you have a tool like VSX, which like if anyone from Slate's listening, like I'd love to try it out to prove me wrong. But like I feel like when you have like 5 or 6 different room emulations, that can cause even more confusion because you're not hearing things flat anymore. Now you're hearing the sound of that room and you're having to learn what it sounds like in that room. Why not just learn how your room sounds, in your headphones?
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm sure all these high-end studios are incredible, but those engineers still had to learn those rooms. Yeah. So you're introducing the same problem, but I don't know. Again, I'd love to try it, but
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I'd love to like dive a little bit further into like your mastering process a little bit then, and we talked about obviously like how you start a project and what you're listening for early on. What are some of like you said, you'll frequently just take some notes when you're doing that first listen. What are some of the biggest problems that you typically see with the masters or the files that you get sent for mastering? Like, are there any common threads you see?
Yeah, so I mean, we spoke about it a little bit earlier. Just clean up things like clicks and pops, which I know is difficult for mix engineers to hear when they've got a million things to think about. But yeah, the only other thing that I would say I find a lot of is just more from the sort of bedroom producers that I work with. Is just you can tell when someone's mixing in a room that's a bit out of whack or badly treated. I'll get a lot of mixes through with quite pronounced low end and things like that. I mean, I have mixers that I'm better friends with who won't take it the wrong way. I have had conversations with them saying, hey, everything you're sending me has got this huge like 100 hertz hump or things like that. So yeah, it's just, and I know, again, treating a room is expensive. So you can't expect everyone to have that perfect room. But again, we were just talking about headphones earlier, so maybe people should try working on headphones more. But yeah, they're the sort of main things that I get. Most of the time now, with people working indoors and things, like I don't really get mixes that are clipping and things like that so much now. So it's mainly just EQ correction, or people will send me mixes that they're really unsure of if the vocals are like too quiet or too loud. That's the only other thing. If people ask me for mix feedback, I'll give them my honest advice of the vocals are too quiet or too loud. Usually, or it's like one lead instrument sort of jumps out at you really loud. That's an insanely loud lead guitar or something like that. Usually if the guitarist's in the band. So and they're mixing it.
It's usually whatever instrument the mixer plays that is the loudest thing, right?
Which again is a bit of a cliche, but you'd be surprised. That's kind of the short answer to what I'm picking up most of the time.
So it sounds like a lot of the issues are obviously like mix related. Do you think that they're more mix related than they are tracking related?
It can be a combination of both. I mean, especially with more people tracking things at home, you do have to get the source right for it to sound good in the mix. The whole fix it in the mix thing is definitely not where you want to be. It is, I'd say it's sort of 60-40. If people were tracking things better, then you wouldn't have such a difficult time in the mix. And if you've ever worked in a big studio or you've received something that's tracked from a really good studio, you can put the faders up and it sounds half mixed already. Same for me when I'm mastering. I have worked with some people that send me mixes from amazing studios like Strong Rooms and stuff over in the UK, and that you'll get it through, and sometimes it's like, why are they even sending me this? It sounds incredible. But you just do a few EQ moves, limit it, and put your stamp of approval on it. But again, a lot of that comes with experience to get the perfect tracking. So,
makes sense. I hear it all the time with tracks that I master all the time too. It's like sometimes you're just like, I wish you could just go back and re-record it. Like, there's only so much you can polish in a mix or in the mastering stage. So, it's great that you can have those lines of communication with your clients to be like, hey, like, here's what I would maybe fix in the mix, like drop the vocal a little bit or bring it up or whatever. But it's always a hard conversation to be like, you might want to go back and re-record it.
It's that is horrible. I mean, thankfully with stuff like the master rebalance in Ozone, and the last version of Ozone where they have the stem settings, you can do insane things with that. So, back in 2015 or something, where I'd have said, could I have the mix again with the vocal up a dB or two? You can try master rebalance and push the vocal up like a dB or two and be like, this is giving me that without any artifacts, so I don't need to go back to the mix now. I won't do that all the time. If I only would probably do that if I was in like a crunch. I've had a few emails of like this song's going on the radio tomorrow and we need it mastered now. That I will do something like that. But we've got these incredible tools now that allow you to do that stuff. So it can save the day sometimes.
Absolutely. What sort of things do you recommend people do to prepare their tracks for mastering? Like, do you have any specific submission requirements that you like to have people follow?
So, I mean, I used to say -3 peak for the headroom. It doesn't matter so much, I think, with like 32-bit float and stuff these days, but I'll still say that to people, so I've got a bit of headroom to work with. With a lot of people putting stuff on their mix bus these days, I'll usually say, turn off your limiter if you've put a limiter on it for the client approval. And I'll ask to get a copy of that as well, because sometimes people have absolutely smashed things with a limiter to get the client to approve it. And, if you're competing with that without knowing that that's what they've heard, it's a bit tricky. I'll usually say to people, if they've done the top-down mixing approach where they've been mixing into a bus compressor the whole time, or, a chain of things like an EQ and compressor and whatever else, I'll say to leave that on usually, because, if they've been mixing that the whole time, then the mix will tend to fall apart without it. And you're starting off on the back foot if they've been mixing into a bus compressor the whole time, and then the balance goes all off. So I'll usually say to keep that on, or if they're really unsure, send me both. And I get some mixers that will even send me like screenshots of their bus compressor and stuff, which is great. If I've got the same plugins, I can start with that, see what's going on, and then put something on that I maybe feel is more appropriate. But that's usually my submission requests. I mean, the basic sort of technical stuff is just send me it at the native sample rate and bit rate of your mix session. Yeah, that's kind of it. And then I'll obviously give them back the multiple formats of whatever they need. But yeah, if somebody's been working at like, I don't know, 96K or something, then they can send me that, and yeah, I can start from there.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it seems like, a lot of people just slap on all that master bus processing because they want it loud, right?
Yeah.
And obviously when it comes to mastering, there's always been that conversation of loudness and, how loud to go. And I'd love to get your take on that too. Like, what are your thoughts on the loudness wars or the levels that you master at? Do you care? Is it something you try to hit?
Yeah, I'm pretty old school in that sense of I do just have one master to rule them all, quote unquote, which I've heard people say. And again, I think, when I got back into mastering recently, sort of 5 years ago, and I started talking to some of the more experienced mastering engineers like the Weird Jungle Collective and some other people. A lot of them were also saying, this thing of use your ears and the track will have its own sort of loudness potential. I do these days, I will master the track and then I'll kind of go back and look at the loudness meter at the end to make sure I haven't done anything crazy. But I do tend to use my ears more. And I think it was John Greenham in an interview recently said something about, for him, most stuff sounds good around like the -9, -10 spot. And although Spotify has got these specs out there of, -4, is -14, I think it is.
Yep.
I should know that off the top of my head. Most tracks will sound better with a little bit more density. And if you look at, everything that's going on in the charts and what most labels are sending out, a consensus, I think, is that stuff sounds better with a little bit more compression than that. And I just find by my ears that most stuff will sound better a little bit more squashed. But, I'm not working on like dance tracks that need to go out like -5, -6. So I haven't got as much of a foot in the game as some people that are working on, a lot of EDM things that, have to be crushed within an inch of their life. But I tend to send out one master and I'll tend to do it at, what I think sounds good. And that does tend to be, I don't know if I'm measuring on laughs, anywhere between like -8 to -11, roughly. I have a couple of clients that have asked me to do a more dynamic master, and if someone asks me to send them two, like a CD master and then one for streaming, I will. And I have sent some stuff out, that people have asked me to do at -12 or, somewhere around that. But if someone doesn't request that, then I will just do one master that I think sounds the best, because the specs have changed and they could change again down the line. And I think you should master a record to sound good as it is at that moment in time. So it can be, timeless and always sound the same, as opposed to, Spotify have changed their specs again, so let's go back and remaster it. And that's my 2 cents. I know stuff gets turned down, but I just like to make it sound right on its own.
I'm with you on that, and especially when you're doing that one master to rule them all thing, it's like CDs are still loud. People are still making CDs loud. Not that many people are listening to CDs these days, but like that's still a thing. And then people are used to it, and who knows? Like if Spotify, they went from, I think it was like -16 originally, now they're -14. Like, are they going to keep creeping it up as well? Like, so like, do you want your master to then become quieter as they bring things up? I don't know. Who knows where it'll go, right? But
I mean, I do like dynamic masters in the sense of, compared to loudness wars stuff, I'm not totally smashing the life out of stuff. But but I don't. A lot of music doesn't sound great at 14. It sounds a bit too dynamic. And there is, I've heard some very experienced mastering engineers say, you've got to make tracks sound good so that when somebody's in their like kitchen and they're listening to it across the room from a Bluetooth speaker, they can hear everything clearly. And if it's too dynamic, they won't be able to hear things properly,
For sure. That's a good point. There's definitely that fine line of like dynamic, but not squashed, like you need to have some of that in there to get that consistency and that energy. I guess it's also very genre dependent as well, right?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Yeah, I wouldn't smash the life out of a, jazz track or something like that. But like I sort of said at the top, I'm working mostly on sort of pop, rock, and bit of metal, bit of synth wavy stuff. So most of what I work on does need a good amount of compression.
Yeah, it needs that kind of wall of sound kind of thing going on.
Very much.
Yeah, totally. Right on. Right on, dude. Well, dude, this has been great learning more about your process, and you know, it's been a lot of fun to learn more about it. One last question I have for you then is like, at the end of the day, what ultimately makes a great mastered mix, in your opinion?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say one that sort of conveys what the artist wants to say in their music. I'm very much, you know, of the belief that, you know, we're in a service industry and you're working for the client, and it's their music, and you've got to translate what they're saying. And as long as you've done that and elevated it and made it sound, you know, bigger and better, then you've done the right thing. And I guess the old mastering engineer do no harm thing as well. You know, don't send them back something that you've utterly destroyed. Yeah, I think elevating their music is the main thing that I'm all about.
Love it. Yeah. That's great, man. I love that. Well, Toby, thanks again for doing this podcast. I really appreciate it. And I think you said this was your first podcast ever.
Yes,
so it's always fun to have people do their first podcast on here. Yeah. Right on, man. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
So that was my episode with Toby Campen, and it was great to dive deeper into his process. And I really enjoyed talking about working on headphones and how he uses headphones for mastering. And even if you're working on mixes instead, you want to make sure that if you are going to be using headphones, that you're listening accurately and that your headphones aren't messing with your stereo perception or your frequency balance. So I love that he talked about those tools like SonarWorks and Can Opener Studio, because those are great tools for making sure that you're getting the most out of your headphones. And I also enjoyed learning a little bit more about how he approaches the concept of knowing when to work in and out of the box. They each have their own strengths, so it's important to get very clear on what elements of each are important to you in your workflow and the sounds that you get too. So yeah, it was definitely cool to learn a little bit more about how he approaches incorporating outboard gear into his traditionally in the box setup. So I hope that you enjoyed that episode too. If you did, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And also, if you could leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, that always goes a long way in terms of letting people know what you think of this podcast and why other people should listen to it. I really appreciate all the reviews and feedback that you guys give me through that. And, you know, my goal is to get this out to more people and help people make more music. So by leaving a review like that, it definitely goes a long way. And lastly, if you're currently working on some new music and you're struggling to get it completed, if you're not sure if it sounds good enough or you're not sure what steps to take to get it sounding pro and make it compete with your favorite records, then I would love to help you. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, that's exactly what I do. I work one-on-one with my students to make sure that they fully understand the entire recording, editing, and mixing processes so that you can make sure that there's no guesswork and that you have a very clear step-by-step process to follow. So together, we'll go through the entire process, make sure that you're following all the right steps, and then you'll get feedback at every step of the way to make sure that you're executing things properly. And the goal behind this is to make sure that you have that confidence and that you're actually getting the results that you want. So if you're looking for some personalized one-on-one feedback on your tracks, or you want some more clarity on what steps to take to get pro results, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can find all of the details of the program there. And then I'd love to hop on a call with you to learn more about your personal goals, what your struggles are right now, what your process looks like, to identify what areas we can focus on to help you see rapid improvements, and come up with a clear action plan for you to follow to get those results. So once again, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can get all the details there. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. Talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.